The dust of Red Mesa, Arizona, tasted of iron and regret. It settled in a fine red film on everything, from the warped boards of the saloon porch to the hopeful pages of the books Abigail Rosewood had carried all the way from Boston. It was the late 1870s, and the town was a raw nerve of opportunity and desperation, a place where fortunes were dug from the earth and just as easily buried. Men with sun-cracked faces and calloused hands drank their wages, their laughter as brittle as the desert scrub. The law was whatever Sheriff Langley said it was, and justice was a heavy pistol worn low on the hip. Abigail, at 23, felt older than the ancient, wind-scarred buttes that watched over the town, an orphan raised under the suffocating piety of an aunt who saw spirit as a thing to be corseted and tamed. She had answered an advertisement for a schoolteacher in the West. It was not an act of courage so much as one of quiet rebellion, a desperate flight toward a horizon she hoped was wide enough to swallow the memory of a loveless, arranged future she had narrowly escaped. She had imagined a place of new beginnings. She found Red Mesa, a town that seemed to care only for endings. Ta-Nehisi saw the world through a stillness he had earned in the cruelest of ways. He worked at the livery stable, his movements with the horses deliberate and silent, a language of touch and low murmurs that the animals understood better than any command. He was Navajo, a warrior who now mucked stalls for men who called him chief with a sneer. His spirit had been forged in the high desert, but a piece of it had been chipped away in a government reform school, an institution designed to bleach the Indian from his soul. They had failed, but they had left scars deeper than any brand, teaching him a profound distrust of the white man's world and its many promises. He spoke little, his dark eyes missing nothing. Their worlds collided on a Tuesday afternoon. Abigail was leaving the mercantile, her arms full of slate tablets and chalk, when a half-wild mustang, tied loosely to the rail, reared at the sudden clatter of a prospector's dropped pan. Hooves flashed, and the crowd of dusty men scattered like quail. Abigail froze, her heart seizing in her chest. The world became a blur of dust and panicked whinnying. Then, a firm hand gripped her arm, pulling her back with a force that was strong but not violent. She stumbled against a solid form. She looked up into the still, dark eyes of Ta-Nehisi. He had moved with the swiftness of a hawk, placing himself between her and the frantic horse. He spoke a single, soft word in his own tongue, and the mustang's terror seemed to lessen, its ears twitching toward the sound. The moment was over as quickly as it had begun. He released her arm, his gaze briefly meeting hers before he turned his attention back to calming the animal. "Thank you," Abigail managed, her voice a reedy whisper. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, not looking at her, but the town was looking at them. From the saloon porch, from the assayer's office, from the shade of the general store's awning. Eyes watched. They were not eyes of gratitude or relief. They were cold, narrow slits of suspicion and contempt. A woman like her, a proper lady from the East, being touched by an Indian. The air grew thick with unspoken slurs. Abigail felt her cheeks burn, a heat that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She gathered her dropped slates and hurried away, the weight of those stares pressing down on her like a physical hand. The fragile piece of Red Mesa shattered a week later. The bank, a small, sturdy building of brick and false confidence, was robbed at high noon. 2 tellers were left bound and gagged, and the safe was emptied of the mining payroll. The thieves had been masked, but a single hoofprint left in the dust outside was all the evidence Sheriff Langley needed. "It's a Navajo pony," he declared to the angry crowd gathering in the street. "I know the shoeing. It's them. They've been getting bolder." A posse was formed in minutes, a grim collection of miners and ranchers fueled by whiskey and prejudice. They rode out with rifles gleaming, eager to hunt. The crime was not just a robbery, it was a violation, an excuse to unleash the simmering resentment that always bubbled just beneath the surface of the town's daily life. Abigail was in the small, one-room schoolhouse late that afternoon. grading arithmetic. When she heard the shouts, she looked out the window to see the posse returning, not with saddlebags full of money, but with a prisoner. They were dragging Tahan Yazi by a rope looped around his wrists. His face was bruised, his lips split, but his back was straight, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond his captors. They threw him to the ground in front of the sheriff's office. Langley stood over him, his face flushed with triumph. "We found him out near the old wash," he bellowed to the gathering crowd. "Had this on him?" He held up a single gold eagle, part of the payroll. "I'd wager. I earned that coin," Tahan said, his voice low and steady, each word a stone dropped into a well of silence. "I worked for it." Langley laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Is that so? Tell us another one?" The sheriff's boot shot out, catching Tahan in the ribs. The crowd roared its approval. A few other men moved in, their fists and boots finding their marks. Abigail watched from her window, a sick knot tightening in her stomach. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. This was not justice. This was a spectacle, a brutal ritual. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was innocent. The man who had moved so gently to save her from a spooked horse was not a thief. The quiet dignity she had seen in him, the deep well of sorrow in his eyes. It did not belong to a bank robber. She saw the faces in the crowd, twisted with a righteous fury that was anything but righteous. They wanted a culprit, and any Navajo would do. Fear was a cold snake coiling in her belly. She was a woman alone, a stranger here. To speak out would be to invite their scorn, their suspicion, perhaps even their violence. Her aunt's voice echoed in her memory, a constant refrain of a woman's place, of the dangers of impropriety and the wisdom of silence. "Stay out of it," the voice warned. "It is not your concern." But the image of Tahan's bruised face, his unwavering gaze, would not leave her. The lessons she taught her students, stories of fairness and courage, of standing up for what is right. They felt like hollow lies on her tongue. Her own past, her flight from a life of suffocating conformity, had been a bid for freedom. What good was that freedom if she stood by and watched a man be brutalized for a crime he did not commit? The conflict tore at her, a battle between the woman she was raised to be and the woman she desperately hoped she could become. That night, a storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple. Wind howled through the gaps in the schoolhouse walls. The town was drinking, celebrating its swift justice. Langley had locked Tahan in a holding cell, but everyone knew a trial was a formality. The gallows behind the jail were already being inspected. Abigail could not sleep. The storm outside was a mirror of the one inside her. Finally, she rose, dressing in the dark. She lit a small lantern, its flame sputtering in the drafts. An idea, wild and reckless, had taken root in her mind. The holding cell was a new addition, but its rear window was little more than a set of iron bars mortared into a weak adobe wall. She slipped out of her small boarding room and crept through the muddy, deserted streets, the lantern shielded beneath her cloak. The back of the jail was dark. Using a crowbar she had taken from the school's woodpile, she began to work at the mortar around the bars. Her hands were clumsy, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching footsteps. After what felt like an eternity, the mortar crumbled. One of the bars loosened. She pulled, her muscles straining, until it came free. She peered into the darkness of the cell. "Yazi," she whispered. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows within. Tahan was at the window. He said nothing, simply watching her. "Go," she urged, her voice trembling. "Take my horse. It is tied behind the schoolhouse. Go east, toward the mountains." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face in the dim, flickering light. He saw not pity, but a fierce, desperate conviction. He reached a hand through the gap, his fingers briefly brushing hers. It was not a gesture of thanks, but of acknowledgement, a silent pact. Then he was gone. melting into the stormy darkness. Abigail hurried back to the schoolhouse, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hid the crowbar and sank onto her small cot, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin, her body trembling uncontrollably. She was no longer just the town schoolteacher. She was an outlaw's accomplice, a traitor to the people she was meant to serve. She thought of Tahan riding into the storm-swept desert. He would not forget this. She knew it. He would see it as a debt, a life owed. And as the first light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Abigail Rosewood knew, with a terrifying and absolute certainty, that her life had just taken a turn onto a path from which there could be no return. The dust of Red Mesa was no longer just on her books, it was in her soul. The fury of the escape was followed by a silence more menacing than any shout. Sheriff Langley had declared Tahan Yazi a fugitive, a murderer in the making, and the town of Red Mesa had locked its doors and its heart. In the days that followed, Abigail Rosewood continued to teach, her voice a steady presence in the one-room schoolhouse that now felt both like a sanctuary and a cage. She spoke to the miners' children of history, of men who fought for what was right, not what was easy. She read them poems about courage and parables about compassion. She did not know that every word drifted up through the floorboards to the small, sweltering attic where Tahan lay hidden. He had circled back under the cover of the storm, his instincts screaming that the open desert was a trap. The only soul in this town who had shown him a shred of humanity was the teacher. So he had come to the schoolhouse, a ghost in the night, and concealed himself in the dusty space above, a place of forgotten books and the smell of dry rot. He listened. He had expected the woman to be soft, a creature of her sheltered world. But as he heard her speak to the children, her words weaving tales of honor and justice, he began to see the steel beneath the Boston lace. She was teaching these white children a code that his own people understood, a code the men in the saloon had long forgotten. He was not just a debt to her. He was beginning to understand her. The town, however, saw only transgression. Whispers followed Abigail like her own shadow. They called her the witch teacher, her Eastern learning a dark magic that had bewitched the Navajo and helped him escape. Women pulled their children closer when she passed in the street. Men at the mercantile fell silent when she entered, their eyes following her with a mixture of suspicion and a crude, unspoken curiosity. She was no longer just an outsider. She was an accomplice, a stain on the town's fragile sense of order. She bought her supplies, held her head high, and returned to the schoolhouse, the weight of their judgment a physical ache in her shoulders. Then the sky turned yellow. A wind began to moan across the flats, a low, mournful sound that grew into a scream. A sandstorm, a demon of dust and fury, descended upon Red Mesa. The sun vanished. The world beyond the schoolhouse windows became a roaring, blinding wall of ochre. Abigail herded the last of her students inside, barring the door against the onslaught. The air grew thick, tasting of grit. Sand found its way through every crack, dusting the room in a fine, suffocating powder. It was a stray spark from the pot-bellied stove, its chimney buffeted by the gale. That did it. A single ember landed on a pile of dry kindling and old newspapers. Flame erupted with a hungry whoosh. In seconds, the dry, ancient timber of the schoolhouse walls began to catch. Smoke, thick and black, filled the room. The children's frightened whimpers turned to panicked screams. Abigail tried to get them to the door, but a burning beam crashed down, blocking the way. The smoke was a clawing thing in her throat, stealing her breath. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped her. They were trapped. Suddenly, a section of the ceiling ripped open from above. Tahan dropped down into the chaos, his face grim, his eyes cutting through the smoke. He moved without hesitation, scooping up two of the smallest children. He shouted at Abigail, his voice a raw command over the roar of the fire. The back window. Together, they worked in the swirling, choking hell. He smashed the window frame with his bare hands, heedless of the splintering wood. He passed children to her, and she guided them through the opening, pushing them out into the lesser danger of the storm. He was strength and speed. She was calm and direction. They moved as one, a silent, desperate team. When the last child was out, a section of the roof collapsed in a shower of fire and sparks. Tahan grabbed Abigail's arm, pulling her through the window just as the flames consumed the space where they had stood. They huddled outside, shielding the weeping children with their bodies as the storm raged and the schoolhouse burned, its flames a ghostly orange blur within the swirling dust. And that is how the town saw them when the storm's fury finally abated an hour later. The schoolteacher and the Navajo fugitive, emerging from the smoke and ruin, covered in soot, surrounded by the children they had saved. They were not heroes in the eyes of the townsfolk who gathered to stare. They were a confirmation of every dark rumor, a scandal made flesh. Sheriff Langley arrived, his face a mask of triumphant rage. He did not ask what happened. He did not offer thanks. He pointed a thick finger at Tahan. "There he is. Grab him." Tahan looked at Abigail. There was no time. He met her gaze for a fraction of a second, a whole conversation passing between them without a word. Then he turned and ran, vanishing into the unsettled dust of the storm's wake before the stunned men could react. Langley turned his fury on Abigail. He declared her little room at the back of the burned schoolhouse a crime scene. His men tramped through it, their boots leaving muddy prints on her floor. It was the sheriff himself who found the evidence he was looking for. In a corner, preserved in a patch of spilled flour near a sack of supplies, was the clear, unmistakable print of a Navajo moccasin. He held up a lamp. Proof, he announced to all who would listen. She harbored him. She is no better than he is. The isolation was now complete. She lost her position, her home, her name. No one would speak to her. No one would meet her eye. She was a pariah. A few days later, a small bundle appeared on the burnt stoop of the school. Inside was a freshly killed rabbit and a piece of carved juniper wood, shaped like a hawk in flight, a promise. He was out there, in the vast, unforgiving desert, and he would be back. That evening, Abigail walked to the town's small, neglected cemetery. A single wooden cross, weathered and gray, had been snapped by the storm's wind. It lay on the ground, a broken symbol of a faith that felt just as fractured within her. She knelt in the red dirt, but no prayer came. She had followed the rules of God and society her entire life, and they had led her here, to this place of ruin and judgment. She had done a right and moral thing, and she was being condemned for it. Her belief in the world she had known, a world of ordered laws and divine justice, lay splintered at her feet. She was packing her few remaining belongings, with no destination in mind, when the stagecoach from the east arrived, shrouded in a cloud of dust. A man stepped out, a man who looked utterly alien in Red Mesa. He wore a fine wool suit, his shoes were polished, and his face was unlined by the sun. He looked around, his expression one of polite bewilderment, until his eyes found her. "Abigail," he said, his voice a ghost from another life. "Evan," she breathed, her heart lurching with a shock that was not entirely pleasant. Dr. Evan Hale, a friend from her past in Boston, a man her aunt had once approved of, a man who represented everything she had fled. He rushed to her side, his eyes taking in her soot-stained dress, the haunted look on her face, the burned shell of the schoolhouse. "My God, Abigail, what has happened to you? I read about the fire in a territorial newspaper. I came as soon as I could." He spoke of Boston, of civilization, of order and law. He painted a picture of her return, a life of comfort and safety, away from this savage land. He urged her to come home with him, to leave this nightmare behind. She listened to his kind, concerned voice, the voice of reason itself. A month ago, she would have wept with gratitude and accepted without a second thought. But as she stood there, in the dust of Red Mesa, with the smell of smoke still in her hair and the memory of Tahan's promise clutched in her heart, she looked at this good man from her old life and saw a stranger. She had changed, The desert had scoured her clean of old certainties. She was no longer the frightened girl who had run from Boston. She did not know what she was now, but she knew one thing. She could not go back. While Tahan moved through the vast, sun-hammered emptiness of the desert, Abigail moved through a prison of her own making. For Tahan, survival was a primal catechism. He tracked lizards across the cracked earth, their small bodies a meager but vital offering of sustenance. He knew how to find water, a few precious drops cupped in the heart of a succulent or collected from a rain-slicked rock face after a brief, violent squall. The sun was his clock, the stars his map. He was a whisper in a landscape of stone and silence, his spirit honed to a fine edge by the beautiful, brutal logic of the wild. In Red Mesa, Abigail was dying a slower, more public death. Dr. Evan Hale's presence was a constant, suffocating kindness. He brought her meals from the hotel, which she barely touched. He spoke of Boston, of logic and reason, his words painting a world she no longer recognized. The townspeople watched them, their gazes like stones. They saw the handsome Eastern doctor trying to save the fallen schoolteacher. Their judgment was a tangible thing, a wall of contempt that left her breathless. She was a living ghost, haunting the edges of a society that had already buried her. Evan, in his heart, believed he was acting out of love. He saw Abigail entangled in a dangerous, primitive affair that would surely destroy her. He saw a savage who had escaped justice and a woman who was too naive to understand the peril she was in. He believed in the law. The law was civilization's bulwark against the chaos of this raw land. And so, using his credentials as a physician from a prominent Boston family, he sent a carefully worded telegram to the federal marshal's office in Prescott. He reported a fugitive, a member of a band of renegade Navajo suspected in a series of raids, being harbored by a local woman. He did it, he told himself, to save her. He was cutting out the infection so the patient could heal. Abigail learned of his betrayal by chance. She was returning a medical text he had lent her when she overheard him speaking with the telegraph operator in hushed, urgent tones, the words "Federal Marshals," "Navajo Band," and "Fugitive Yazzie" struck her like a physical blow. She froze behind a stack of crates, her blood turning to ice. Evan was not trying to save her. He was arranging a hunt. He was using the weight and power of the government to crush a man he did not know, all in the name of a misguided, possessive form of protection. A wind was rising, the same mournful sound she had heard the day the schoolhouse burned. The sky was turning a sickly shade of brown. Another storm was coming. She knew Tahan's promise to return was not an empty one. He would be out there, somewhere close, watching, and the marshals would not be like Sheriff Langley's drunken posse. They would be relentless, efficient killers. There was no choice. There was never a choice. She ran to the livery, the only place that would still do business with her, and threw her last few dollars on the counter for the use of a sturdy gelding. She rode out of Red Mesa without a backward glance, the first grains of sand already stinging her face. The world dissolved into a howling, gritty twilight. The storm was a physical beast, trying to tear her from the saddle, to scour her from the earth. She bent low over the horse's neck, her hair whipping free from its pins, her eyes slits against the blinding onslaught, guided only by a desperate instinct, a prayer that she was heading toward the hawk-shaped juniper wood he had left for her. She found him in the lee of a rock outcropping, a still figure beside his horse. He had seen her coming, a lone rider battling the storm. He simply took the reins of her horse and led them, wordlessly, to a narrow fissure in the canyon wall she would never have noticed. It opened into a small, dry cave, a pocket of stillness in the heart of the roaring wind. He built a small, smokeless fire from dry scrub he had gathered, its light pushing back the shadows and the biting cold. For a long time, they just sat, listening to the storm rage outside. The raw, elemental fury seemed to strip away all pretense, leaving only the truth. "They will come for you," she said, her voice hoarse from the dust. "Federal marshals. Dr. Hale sent for them." Tahan stared into the small fire, his face a mask of old sorrows. He was not surprised. He had never expected anything different from her world. "The white man's law has a long memory," he said, his voice quiet. He told her then of his past, not in a torrent of words, but in spare, stark images. He spoke of a dawn raid by soldiers, of the smell of smoke and the screams that were silenced too quickly. He spoke of being a boy, hidden in a corn crib, watching as his family was erased from the earth. They were not warriors. He said they were farmers. They were my people. The soldiers called it a victory. After that, the reform school was meant to save his soul. It had only taught him how to hate. "I swore then," he said, his gaze lifting to meet hers, his eyes burning with a cold fire, "that I would never again bow my head." The story settled in the space between them, a weight of grief that made Abigail's own troubles feel small and pale. She owed him her own truth in return. "I ran away," she confessed, the words tasting like rust in her mouth. "From Boston. My aunt, my guardian, she had arranged a marriage for me, to a man I did not love, a good man, a wealthy man. He would have given me a fine house and a respectable life, and it would have been a cage. I would have suffocated. So I came west, pretending it was for a noble purpose, to teach. But I was only running." Tahan looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she felt he saw not the school teacher, not the white woman, but the soul of her. "We are not so different," he said softly. "We both seek a land where we can breathe." The storm howled, and a sudden, violent gust found its way into the cave, making the fire dance and spitting sand. Abigail shivered, a deep, bone-rattling chill that was more from exhaustion and fear than the cold. A fit of coughing seized her, her lungs raw from the dust and smoke of the past weeks. She swayed, and Tahan's arm was there, steadying her. He looked at the tight bodice of her dress, the rigid structure that was so ill-suited to this world. "You cannot breathe in that," he said. It was a simple statement of fact. Her dress was fastened with a line of tiny, intricate buttons at the back, impossible for her to reach, and beneath it was the corset, the whalebone and steel cage she had worn every day of her adult life. It was digging into her ribs, making each ragged breath a painful effort. Tahan moved behind her, his fingers, calloused from rains and rock but surprisingly gentle, found the first small button at her neck. She flinched at his touch, every rule of propriety she had ever learned screaming in her mind, but she did not pull away. His hands were not demanding, not possessive. They were careful, methodical. He worked his way down her spine, releasing each button until the dress loosened. Then came the corset laces. He tugged at the knot, his knuckles brushing against her skin. She held her breath. The world seemed to shrink to the space of that small cave, to the sound of the fire, the storm, and the whisper of the laces being pulled through the eyelets. The rigid cage fell away. She took a breath, a deep, shuddering gasp of air that filled her lungs for what felt like the first time in her life. The relief was so profound it made her dizzy. She turned to face him in the flickering candlelight, her loosened dress falling softly around her, her hair a wild halo. The intimacy of the moment hung between them, more powerful than any kiss. They were two fugitives, stripped of everything, with only this fragile sanctuary to their name. She saw the profound loneliness in his eyes, a mirror of her own. He had unlaced the armor she had worn against the world. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, the enormity of what they had just shared, what she had just allowed, crashed over her. She was undone, in every sense of the word, a virgin from Boston, in a cave with a Navajo warrior, her corset lying on the dirt floor. She gasped, the sound a mix of shock and a strange, liberating certainty. "You had better marry me after this," she whispered. A slow, sad smile touched Tahan's lips, the first she had ever seen. He reached out, not to touch her body, but to gently wipe the tear from her face with his thumb. "In my heart," he said, his voice a low vow. "I already have." He took a blanket from his saddle roll and draped it around her shoulders. They lay down on opposite sides of the fire, the heat a comforting presence between them. But as the exhaustion of the day finally claimed them, his hand found hers in the space between, their fingers intertwined, a silent anchor in the storm. Abigail fell asleep to the sound of his steady breathing, a fragile peace settling over her for the first time in weeks. But later, in the deep hours of the night, a new sound worked its way into her dreams, a sound that cut through the dying howl of the wind, the distant, rhythmic beat of shod horses, moving fast, moving with purpose, drawing ever closer. The dawn that broke over the canyon was cold and sharp, painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised lilac and blood orange. It brought no comfort. Tahan heard them first, the faint, rhythmic drumming of many horses moving with military precision. He was on his feet in an instant, his body a steady, intense stillness, his eyes fixed on the narrow mouth of the canyon. The hope, born in the storm-swept cave, died in the clean, unforgiving light of morning. They came into view moments later, a column of dark figures against the rising sun, federal marshals, their flat-brimmed hats and grimly efficient posture a world away from Langley's rabble, and leading them, his bulk seeming to overflow his saddle, was the sheriff himself, his face a mask of smug vengeance. Riding with them, looking pale and ill at ease in his fine eastern suit, was Dr. Evan Hale. He had come to witness the orderly application of the law, but his eyes were filled with a dawning horror at the brutal reality of the force he had summoned. Sheriff Langley rode into Red Mesa at the head of the column, his voice booming with authority. "We are here to clean out this nest of renegades," he declared to the townspeople who gathered to watch. "This is federal business now. We will hunt down every last one of them and bring them to justice." His words were for the marshals, but his eyes were for the desert, a promise of eradication aimed at one man. In the canyon, Abigail watched the approaching riders, her hand flying to her throat. There were too many, a dozen, perhaps more. They were not a posse. They were an army. Tahan stood beside her, his face carved from stone. He watched them dismount at the canyon's entrance. Setting up positions with cold professionalism, they were trapped. He turned to her, his gaze soft but unyielding. "I will go out," he said. "They came for me. If I surrender, they will leave you be." "No!" The word was a strangled cry in her throat. "No, they will not just take you. You saw Langley. This is not about justice. It is a hunt. I did not save you so you could die." His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You gave me back my life," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I will not let them take yours because of it. This is my fight. You must stay here, hidden. When it is over, you must ride away." He pressed the carved juniper hawk into her hand and turned before she could argue further. He walked out from behind the rocks, into the open space of the canyon floor, his hands raised to show they were empty. He was a lone, defiant figure against the towering red walls. "Surrender," he called, his voice clear and carrying in the morning air. Sheriff Langley laughed, a sound that cracked like a whip. He raised his rifle. For a moment, the world held its breath. Evan, standing beside the sheriff, saw the raw hatred in the man's eyes and knew this was never about a lawful arrest. He saw Abigail, a small figure half hidden by the rocks, directly in Langley's line of sight. The first shot did not come from Langley. One of the marshals, nervous and eager, fired. The bullet sparked off the rock near Tahan's head, and the canyon exploded into a deafening chaos of noise and violence. Gunfire echoed and re-echoed from the stone walls, a continuous rolling thunder. Horses screamed and reared, their eyes wide with terror. Red dust, kicked up by ricocheting bullets and panicked hooves, filled the air, turning the scene into a murky, swirling vision of hell. Tahan dove for cover, the warrior's instinct taking over. He had a knife, but against a dozen rifles, it was nothing. He moved like a phantom between the boulders, a fleeting target that the marshals struggled to track in the blinding dust. Evan watched the unfolding carnage, his stomach churning with self-loathing. This was the law he had revered, the civilization he had championed. It was a firing squad. He saw Langley take deliberate aim, not at the moving shadow of Tahan, but at the place where he had seen Abigail. He was going to eliminate the witness. In that instant, Evan's civilized world collapsed. All that remained was a single, primal instinct to protect. He lunged, not with any thought for himself, but only for her. "Abigail!" he shouted, shoving her with all his might. She stumbled back behind the solid wall of a boulder as the sound of Langley's rifle shot cracked the air. A blossoming red stain appeared on the front of Dr. Evan Hale's fine wool coat. He looked down at it, a strange expression of surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground. Seeing Evan fall, seeing the rifle that had shot him still pointed toward Abigail, broke something loose in Tahan. The quiet, watchful man who mucked stalls and spoke in whispers was gone. In his place was the warrior his people had named him, a spirit of righteous fury. He burst from his cover, not away from the gunfire, but toward it. He ran in a low crouch, a knife clutched in his hand, his movements a blur of lethal grace. A marshal turned, surprised by the sudden charge, but Tahan was too fast. He disarmed the man and seized his rifle, firing from the hip as he continued his charge. The world narrowed to a single point, the bloated, hate-filled face of Sheriff Langley, who was fumbling to reload. He crashed into the sheriff, sending both of them tumbling into the dust. Langley was bigger, heavier, but Tahan was fueled by a pure, cold rage. They rolled and grappled, a desperate, grunting struggle. Langley's pistol went off, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the dirt. Tahan brought the butt of the rifle down on the sheriff's wrist, and the gun clattered away. For a moment, they were just two men, fighting with fists and fury. Langley's bulk gave him an advantage, his meaty hands closing around Tahan's throat. Tahan's vision began to gray at the edges, but his hand found the knife at his belt. He drove it upward, once, with all the force left in his body. Langley grunted, a sound of pained surprise. His grip loosened. He stared at Tahan, his eyes wide with disbelief, before he collapsed sideways, the dust of red mesa already beginning to claim him. Tahan staggered to his feet. Swaying, he looked down and saw the dark, spreading stain on his own side. One of the marshal's stray bullets had found its mark during his charge. The world began to spin, the roar of the gunfight fading to a dull hum. Abigail ran from her hiding place, oblivious to the remaining marshals, who were now confused and leaderless. She saw only Tahan, wounded, and Evan, lying still on the ground. She reached Tahan just as his legs gave out. She caught him, her small frame straining under his weight, and dragged him back, inch by painful inch, into the relative safety of the rocks. The gunfight faltered, the marshals unsure of their orders now that the sheriff was dead. But they would regroup. They had to get away. Tahan was bleeding badly, his breathing shallow. She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound, but she knew it was not enough. The bullet was still inside. She looked around in desperation. A supply wagon, hit by a stray shot, was burning nearby. Its flames licked at the sky. She saw Tahan's knife, fallen in the dirt, an image from a medical text. A brutal lesson in battlefield surgery flashed in her mind. Gritting her teeth, she took the knife and held the blade in the heart of the fire until the steel glowed a hellish red. She knelt beside him. "Tahan," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This will hurt." He met her gaze, his eyes clouded with pain but clear with trust. He gave a single, slow nod. Abigail took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to a God she was no longer sure she believed in, and made the cut. As if in answer, the wind, which had been still since the dawn, began to moan. The sky, which had been clear, turned a familiar, terrifying yellow. The dust of the battle was joined by a greater dust, a tidal wave of sand that rose from the desert floor. A sandstorm, more violent and sudden than the last, descended upon the canyon. It was a fire in the sky, a roaring, blinding curtain that swallowed the sun, the marshals, and the sounds of battle. It was a force of nature, indiscriminate and absolute, a great and terrible cleansing. When the new dawn finally broke through the haze, the canyon was scoured and silent. The marshals were gone, scattered and defeated by the storm. Evan's body was gone, either taken by them or buried by the shifting sands. The town of Red Mesa, battered by the storm, was a place of shuttered windows and fearful whispers. For Abigail Rosewood, the teacher, there was no place left there. For Tahan Yazi, the warrior, there was only the life she had saved. With 2 stolen horses and the clothes on their backs, they turned south toward the promise of the border, 2 fugitives running from a world in ruins, leaving only ghosts and red dust behind them. The world south of the border was a different kind of furnace. The red dust of Arizona gave way to a pale, shimmering sand that seemed to drink the sun and radiate it back with a malevolent intensity. For days, they rode through a landscape of thorns and bones. The air was thick with the smells of their own sweat, the metallic tang of Tahan's slowly healing wound, and the dry, ancient dust of the Sonoran desert. At night, the rattling buzz of a snake was their lullaby. By day, the drone of insects was their only company. This was not a land that offered refuge. It was a land that tested, that stripped away everything but the will to draw the next breath. Abigail Rosewood was remade in that crucible. The woman who had packed books and chalk for a new life now carried a water skin, a rifle she had taken from the battle, and the grim knowledge of field surgery. Tahan, weakened by his injury and the fever that followed, became her patient and her teacher. In the first days, he would drift in and out of consciousness, and she would clean his wound with the last of their good water. Her stitches a clumsy but determined imitation of what she had read in Dr. Hale's medical texts. The sight of his blood no longer made her faint. It made her focused. When he was lucid, he taught her, he showed her how to read the land, to find the faint, almost invisible trails that led to hidden seeps of water. He taught her how to build a fire with a hand drill and a tuft of dry grass, a skill that felt like a miraculous act of creation in the vast emptiness. He showed her which plants were poison and which held moisture in their roots. The Boston schoolteacher, who had once taught lessons on a slate, was now learning the brutal grammar of survival. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to the feel of paper, became chapped and calloused, but they were more capable than they had ever been. They crossed paths with no one for more than a week. They were ghosts in a sun-bleached purgatory. Finally, when their food was gone and Tahan's fever returned, they saw a smudge of green in the distance, and then the low, brown shapes of adobe buildings. It was a village, little more than a handful of houses clustered around a dusty plaza and a whitewashed church with a silent, cracked bell. Their arrival caused a stir. A gringo woman with hair the color of straw, her face burned by the sun, and an Indian, his arm in a sling, his face a mask of exhausted pride. They were an apparition, a story that had wandered out of the desert. People watched from doorways, their dark eyes full of a cautious curiosity. It was a woman who approached them, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her black hair streaked with silver and tied in a neat bun. She carried herself with the quiet authority of one who has seen much and judged little. She introduced herself as Señora Luz. She was a widow, and she owned the small, clean cantina and the 2 rooms she rented out behind it. She looked at Abigail's desperate face, at Tahan leaning heavily on his horse, and she did not ask for their names or their story. She simply said, in a mixture of Spanish and halting English, "The desert is hard. Come, you will rest." Her inn was a sanctuary, The thick adobe walls kept out the relentless heat. The air inside smelled of chili, wood smoke, and something clean, like lime. Senora Luz fed them a stew of goat meat and beans that tasted to Abigail like the finest meal she had ever eaten. She gave them a room with a sturdy bed and a basin of cool water. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they were safe. As Tahan recovered his strength, he began to earn their keep. He had a way with horses, a silent communication that the local ranchers, who valued good horseflesh above all else, recognized and respected. He worked in the Senora's stables, mending tack, shoeing horses, and transforming neglected animals with a gentle, knowing hand. He rarely spoke, but his work spoke for him. Abigail, desperate for a purpose beyond mere survival, noticed the children of the village. They were bright-eyed and quick, but they ran wild, with no school to attend. She approached Senora Luz, offering to teach them in exchange for their lodging, in the shaded courtyard of the inn, with charcoal and a smoothed patch of adobe for a blackboard. Abigail Rosewood became a teacher once more. She taught them their letters, their numbers, and the English words that might one day help them navigate the world of the border. The villagers watched, and they gave them new names. They did not know them as a fugitive and his accomplice. They saw the quiet, powerful man who healed their animals and the kind, patient woman who taught their children. They became La Maestra y el Guerrero, the teacher and the warrior, for a while. In this small, forgotten corner of the world, they found a fragile peace. They were not running. They were living. But fear has deep roots. It followed them even here. Occasionally, a patrol of American lawmen would ride through the village, their uniforms and their confident swagger a stark reminder of the world they had fled. On those days, Senora Luz would hide them in a dry well behind the inn, and they would wait in the darkness, their hearts pounding in unison, until the sound of the horses faded. The threat was a shadow that always lingered at the edge of their new life, a promise that their peace was borrowed, not owned. One sweltering afternoon, while teaching a lesson on arithmetic, a wave of dizziness washed over Abigail. She had been feeling tired for weeks, a deep weariness she had attributed to the heat and the lingering strain of their journey. But this was different. A sudden, powerful nausea sent her stumbling from the courtyard. Later, in the privacy of their room, she counted the weeks, her mind a frantic mess of calculation and dawning realization. The night in the cave, the storm, their desperate flight. It was impossible. And yet, it was true. She was with child. She told Tahan that evening, as they sat outside, watching the stars ignite in the vast, velvet blackness of the desert sky. Her voice was a bare whisper. He said nothing for a long time, simply took her hand in his. His touch was her only anchor in a sea of joy and terror. This child, conceived in chaos and desperation, would be born into a life of exile. It was a blessing, and it was a potential tragedy. He stood up and went into their room. He returned a moment later with a single, precious tallow candle, one he had been saving. He lit it, its small flame a fragile beacon in the immense darkness. He took her other hand, his dark eyes searching her face in the flickering golden light. "In the eyes of my people," he said, his voice low and solemn, "a man who takes a woman's hand, who provides for her, who pledges his heart to her, he is her husband. In the eyes of your God, a ceremony is needed." He gestured to the single flame. "Let this be our witness." And so, under the silent gaze of 1,000,000,000 stars, with a single candle for a priest and the desert wind for a choir, they were married. Abigail Rosewood, the teacher from Boston, and Tahan Yazi, the Navajo warrior. She spoke the vows from her own tradition, and he spoke a pledge in his dying language, a promise to walk beside her, to protect her, to honor her for all the days of his life. There was no paper, no priest, no audience, but the vast, silent land that had nearly destroyed them and had ultimately given them refuge. The small flame burned, a tiny, defiant star of hope against the overwhelming darkness, a testament to a love that had taken root in the harshest soil imaginable. Stories, like seeds, travel on the wind. The tale of the Red Mesa shootout blew across the border, carried by mule drivers and prospectors, and it changed with every telling. In dusty cantinas and around lonely campfires, the story grew. Tahan Yazi was no longer just a man. He was a legend, a ghost of the canyons, a fearsome warrior who had single-handedly killed a sheriff and vanished into the desert. Abigail became a footnote in his story, the bewitched white woman who had fallen under his spell. The legend became official when a bounty was offered, a piece of paper nailed to posts in dusty border towns, offering $500 American for the capture of the Navajo renegade. The drawing was a crude, menacing caricature that looked nothing like the quiet man Abigail knew. But the threat it represented was real and deadly. The world they had fled was not forgetting. It was waiting. That world had not been finished with Dr. Evan Hale, either. The marshals had found him in the aftermath of the sandstorm, alive but barely. A bullet had torn through his lung, and for weeks he had hovered in the gray space between life and death at an Army Fort hospital. He had survived. But the man who recovered was not the same one who had ridden into Red Mesa full of civilized certainty. The physical pain of his wound was a dull ache compared to the sharp, persistent agony of his conscience. He had seen the law he revered twisted into a tool of personal vengeance. He had seen the man he condemned act with honor, and he had nearly caused the death of the woman he professed to love. When he was finally deemed fit for duty, he was debriefed by a senior marshal, a man with eyes like chips of granite. They did not see his actions as a moment of noble intervention. They saw a compromised agent, a failed mission, and a dead local lawman. They saw a mess that needed to be cleaned up, to redeem himself, to prove his loyalty was to the law and not to a woman. He was given a new command: find the fugitives. He was to lead a small, elite team, and this time, there were to be no mistakes. Evan accepted the order, his face a neutral mask that hid the roiling conflict in his soul. He would hunt them, because it was his duty, but what he would do when he found them, he did not know. In the small Sonoran village, life had found a fragile rhythm. Abigail's pregnancy progressed, her body changing in a way that was both wondrous and terrifying. Senora Luz clucked over her like a mother hen, prescribing herbal teas and ensuring she had the best cuts of goat meat. The village women, who had at first been shy and reserved, now included her in their circle, sharing advice and old wives' tales with a gentle familiarity. She gave birth on a hot, breathless night in late summer, in the same room where she and Tahan had found refuge. It was a difficult labor, but Senora Luz was a capable midwife, her hands sure and her voice a calming murmur. When it was over, Abigail lay exhausted but triumphant, holding a perfect, beautiful baby girl. She had her mother's fair skin and a dusting of fine, dark hair that promised to be the color of a raven's wing, like her father's. They named her Lucia, in honor of the woman who had become their protector, their family. Tahan was a changed man. He held his daughter with a reverence that made Abigail's heart ache. This tiny, helpless creature was a bond between them more powerful than any vow. He was no longer just a warrior, a survivor. He was a father. A few days after the birth, he sat outside their door for hours, a small knife and a piece of hardwood in his hands. He worked with intense concentration, and when he was finished, he showed Abigail. He had taken the hunting knife he always carried and had painstakingly carved a small, intricate sun symbol into the pommel of the handle. It was a blessing from his people, a prayer for a long and sunlit life for their daughter. He laid the knife beside the sleeping baby, a silent promise of protection. Evan's search was methodical, a slow and patient narrowing of the vast desert. He was not a lawman, but he was a man of science, and he applied that same logic to his hunt. He followed the whispers, the faint trails of rumor. He knew they would need a place with water, a place where they could blend in. He spoke to ranchers and traders, showing the bounty poster, his voice detached and professional, his eyes searching for the flicker of recognition that would betray them. He found the village in the cool of an autumn afternoon. He left his men camped a few miles away and rode in alone, dressed as a simple traveler. He sat in the shade of the cantina, nursing a warm beer, watching, and then he saw her. Abigail was in the courtyard, just as she had been in Red Mesa, surrounded by a small group of children. She was pointing at letters she had drawn on the wall, and her voice, though softer, was the same, full of a gentle, encouraging patience. On a blanket at her feet, a small baby lay cooing at the sky. Abigail laughed at something a child said, a free, unburdened sound of pure joy. It was a sound Evan had never heard from her in Boston. Then Tahan emerged from the stables. He moved with the same quiet grace, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes. He walked to the blanket and knelt, his large, calloused hand hovering over his daughter's head with infinite tenderness. He looked at Abigail, and she smiled at him, a smile of such deep, uncomplicated love that it struck Evan like a physical blow. This was not a captive and her captor. This was not a fallen woman and her savage lover. This was a family. This was the peace she had been searching for, a peace his world could never have given her. In that moment, the law, his duty, his entire past, it all turned to dust. To bring them back would not be justice. It would be a desecration. He stood up, paid for his beer, and walked toward the courtyard. For one heart-stopping second, his eyes met Abigail's across the plaza. He saw a flicker of recognition, of pure terror, in her gaze. And then he did the hardest, most honorable thing of his life. He looked straight through her, his face a blank mask of polite indifference, and walked to his horse. He mounted and rode away. The lawman who had chosen not to see. His act of mercy, however, could not stop the turning of a crueler fate. A week later, a different patrol rode into the village. They were not federal marshals on a mission. They were border guards, bored, thirsty, and arrogant. One of them had a copy of the bounty poster, crumpled and stained. He saw Tahan crossing the plaza, carrying Lucia in his arms. The soldier's shout was a raw, ugly gash in the afternoon quiet. He recognized the man from the poster. Pistols were drawn. The villagers scattered. Abigail screamed from the doorway of the inn. Tahan's only thought was for the child in his arms. He turned his body, shielding Lucia as the first shot rang out. Pain, white-hot and sickening, tore through his shoulder. He stumbled, but did not fall, his arms tightening around his daughter. Suddenly, a rider galloped into the plaza from the west, firing a pistol into the air. It was Evan. He had not gone far. He had been watching, a guardian angel they did not know they had. "Federal business!" he yelled, his voice ringing with an authority the guards could not question. "This man is my prisoner. Stand down." The guards, confused and startled by the appearance of a well-dressed American, hesitated. It was the moment Tahan and Abigail needed. She ran to him, taking the crying baby, and together they scrambled for the stables, for the horses that were their only hope of escape. Evan dismounted, placing himself between the soldiers and the fleeing family. He held up a hand. "Let them go," he said, his voice low and steady. "It is over." The lead guard, angry at being cheated of his bounty, was not listening to reason. He raised his pistol. The shot echoed in the small plaza. Evan stood for a moment, a look of calm resignation on his face, before he fell forward into the dust. His sacrifice had bought them the time they needed. They rode out of the village and into the anonymous safety of the desert, the cries of their daughter mingling with the sound of the wind. Later, when they were sure they were not followed, they circled back. They found his body where he had fallen, in a small, quiet grove of mesquite trees, under the unblinking eyes of the stars. They buried him. Abigail fashioned a simple cross from 2 branches tied with a strip of her own dress. There were no prayers she could remember that seemed to fit the moment. She simply stood over the fresh mound of earth, her hand resting on the shoulder of the wounded man beside her, and spoke the truth that had been forged in her heart. "Justice ain't the law," she whispered to the silent desert. "It's mercy. 5 years is a lifetime. It is long enough for a wound to become a scar, for a memory to soften at the edges, and for a hunted existence to slowly, cautiously, put down roots." The border they had crossed was not just a line on a map. It was a line drawn through their lives, separating the frantic, violent past from a quiet, hard-won present. They had traveled further south, away from the nervous energy of the border towns, following the promise of a river they had heard spoken of in whispers. They found it, a ribbon of life-giving water that carved a fertile valley out of the harsh Sonoran landscape. And there, they stopped running. They built their home with their own hands, mixing mud and straw to make the adobe bricks, raising the walls under the patient eye of the sun. It was a small, sturdy house, its back to the desert and its face to the river. It was a home, not a hiding place. Beside it, they planted a field of corn, the green shoots a miracle of defiance against the surrounding dust. In a corral made of mesquite branches, they kept horses. The 2 they had fled on had become the seed of a small, strong herd, their descendants known for their stamina and intelligence. The years had reshaped them. Abigail's face was browned by the sun, with fine lines around her eyes from squinting into the light. The tentative girl from Boston was gone, replaced by a woman whose hands knew the heft of an axe, the feel of rising dough, and the rhythm of the seasons. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface of her days, but it no longer ruled her. Tahan, too, had settled into a new version of himself. The warrior's hypervigilance had eased, replaced by the watchful peace of a father and a husband. His hands, which had known the cold steel of a knife, were now most often found gentling a nervous colt or holding his daughter's small hand. Luzia was the heart of their new world. At 5 years old, she was a child of the river and the sun, as nimble and sure-footed as a mountain goat. She was a bridge between her parents, a living testament to their unlikely love. She chattered away in a seamless blend of English and Navajo, her vocabulary a map of her unique heritage. From her mother, she learned her letters, drawing them in the damp sand by the riverbank. From her father, she learned the names of the desert plants and the stories of the stars, stories that were ancient when Boston was still a swamp. Their life found a new purpose, a new rhythm. Tahan's skill with horses had not gone unnoticed. Traders leading mule trains through the valley learned of the quiet Indian who could calm the wildest stallion with a touch and a murmur. They brought him their most difficult animals, and he trained them, his payment not in dollars, but in salt, coffee, tools, and bolts of cloth. He became a respected figure, a man whose word was his bond and whose skill was undeniable. Abigail, in turn, had found her way back to her own calling. Several other Navajo families, displaced and driven south by the relentless pressure of the American army, had settled in the valley, drawn by the water and the relative peace. Their children, like Lucia, were growing up between 2 worlds. Abigail began to teach them. In the shade of a cottonwood tree, she held a school not of forced assimilation, but of shared knowledge. She taught them to read and write in English, the language of the powerful world to the north. But she also encouraged them to speak their own tongue, to remember their own stories. She was not the witch teacher here. She was simply La Maestra, a title spoken with respect and affection. For 5 years, this fragile peace held. The bounty poster yellowed and tore on distant posts. The legend of the Red Mesa shootout became just one more violent story in a violent land. And then, the old enemy, the one that carries no gun and rides no horse, found them. It came in the heat of late summer, a sickness that moved like a ghost through the valley. It began with a shivering fever, followed by a deep, aching pain. and then the terrifying yellowing of the skin and eyes. Yellow fever, a name whispered with a primal dread. It started in a trading camp downriver and spread with terrifying speed. People who had been healthy one day were dead by the end of the week. There was no doctor, no medicine, only fear and the folk remedies that were powerless against this invisible killer. The small community began to panic. Abigail watched the first victim succumb, and a cold dread, familiar and sharp, returned, but with it came the echo of another life, the memory of Dr. Hale's books, of diagrams and descriptions of disease she had once read out of intellectual curiosity. She remembered the passages on sanitation, on contagion, on the importance of clean water and the properties of certain plants. While others prayed or fled, Abigail began to work. She took charge with a quiet authority that no one questioned. She turned her home into a makeshift infirmary. First, she insisted that all water for drinking be boiled. It was a simple, laborious step that met with resistance, but she was adamant. She organized the healthy, sending them to care for the sick in shifts, insisting they wash their hands and clothes thoroughly after each visit. She remembered reading about the bark of the willow tree, how an infusion could bring down a fever. She sent Tahan and the other men to strip bark from the willows that grew along the river, and she brewed a bitter, powerful tea, forcing it down the throats of the sick. She worked day and night, her face a grim mask of exhaustion. She moved from pallet to pallet, cooling fevered brows, cleaning the sick, and speaking words of comfort. The Boston schoolteacher was gone, replaced by a fierce, determined healer, fighting a war with knowledge as her only weapon. Tahan was her silent, unwavering support. He made sure the fires for boiling water never went out. He kept Lucia safe and away from the sickness, taking her high into the hills during the day. He hunted for game, ensuring the healthy had food to keep up their strength. One night, as she sat by the fire, her body aching with a weariness that went bone deep, she looked at the rows of sick people lying in the flickering light. Another child had died that afternoon. The weight of the loss, the sheer, relentless struggle of it all, threatened to break her. "Why is it always a fight?" she whispered to Tahan, who had come to sit beside her. "We run from men with guns, and then a plague finds us. Will we never know peace?" Tahan looked not at the sick, but at her, his wife, her face smudged with soot, her hands raw, her spirit as fierce and bright as the fire itself. He took her hand. His voice was quiet, but it held the certainty of a mountain. "The fighting is over," he said. "That part of our life is done. This is different. We survived. Now we owe something back." He looked around the room, at the people of the valley, Navajo and Mexican, all of them caught in the same struggle. "We owe life," he said, his voice resonating with a simple, profound truth, not war. His words were an anchor. They reframed their existence. They were not cursed. They were survivors. And survival came with a responsibility. They had been given a second chance, and that chance was not meant to be hoarded in fear, but to be shared. From that moment on, Abigail fought with a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just trying to save her family. She was fighting for her community, for this new world they had built. The fever finally broke as the weather cooled. It left a wake of grief and sorrow. But it did not destroy the valley. Many had been lost, but many more, the people whispered, had been saved by La Maestra. The shadows of the past, the fear of the bounty hunter and the lawmen, had seemed so large for so long, but in the face of a true, indiscriminate plague, they shrank. The legend of the renegade warrior who killed a sheriff had faded, replaced in this small corner of the world by a new story, a living one. It was the story of the horse trainer who provided for his people, and the teacher who had become a healer. They were no longer fugitives. They were the heart of a community that had faced death and chosen life. The river valley was a world unto itself, governed by the rising of the sun and the slow turning of the seasons. Years passed, marked not by calendars but by the height of the corn, the number of new foals in the corral, and the growth of a dark-haired girl who was the living heart of it all. Lucia was now 10, with her mother's thoughtful eyes and her father's quiet, confident grace. The past was a story, a collection of whispered names and distant places that had no more reality for her than the legends her father told her about Coyote and the first people. This valley, this small, sun-drenched patch of earth, was the only world she knew. It was, for her, the entire world. The man who came was a disruption, a stone thrown into a still pond. He rode in on a tired-looking horse, a gringo with a notebook in his saddlebag and a persistent, questioning look in his eyes that made Abigail's old fears stir from their long slumber. He was not a lawman or a soldier. He introduced himself as Arthur Vance, a journalist from a New York newspaper. He had heard a story. He said, a legend that had drifted east on the winds of rumor. He spoke of a brave schoolteacher and a noble Navajo warrior, of a great injustice and a love that had defied a nation's prejudice. He wanted to write the true story. He spoke to Senora Luz first, who was now a matriarch, her back bent with age but her eyes as sharp as ever. She listened to him with polite suspicion, offering him a drink but no information. The people of the valley had long memories and a deep-seated distrust of inquisitive strangers. The journalist's questions, however well-intentioned, were a threat to the quiet peace they all guarded so fiercely. When he finally approached Abigail, as she was packing away the slates from the day's lessons, her response was swift and cold. "No," she said, "the word a wall of ice. There is no story here. You have wasted your journey. Please leave us in peace." The fear that gripped her was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her heart. This man, with his notebook and his neatly trimmed mustache, was more dangerous than a man with a gun. A gun could kill the body, but a story could kill the soul. It could kill the peace she had spent a decade building. It could dig up the graves she had worked so hard to fill. It could put their names back into the mouths of men in power, reminding them that a bounty was still officially unpaid. She thought of Lucia, who knew nothing of sheriffs and shootouts, who knew only the warmth of the sun and the love of her parents. She would not risk that. She would not let this stranger turn their life into a spectacle for the entertainment of his readers. That night, she could not sleep. She told Tahan of her fears, her voice a low, tense whisper in the darkness of their room. "He wants to make a show of us," she said. "He will write about the blood and the fire, and they will call you a killer and me a fool. They will not understand. They will twist it into something ugly, and that ugliness will find us here. It will find Lucia." Tahan listened, his silence a comforting weight beside her. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice the sound of stones settling in a riverbed. "Our story is our own," he said. "We have lived it. It is carved into us. No man's words can change what is true." He reached for her hand in the dark. "But a story that is hidden is a story that can be stolen. Others will tell it, and they will tell it with the lies. Your daughter will hear those lies one day. Is it not better that she hear the truth from you?" His words were simple, but they cut through her fear to the heart of the matter. She had been trying to protect Lucia by burying the past, but the past was a part of them, a part of the daughter they had made. To deny it was to deny a piece of who they were and who she was. The truth, however painful, was her birthright. The next day, she sent for Arthur Vance. She agreed to speak with him, on one condition. He would write down what she said exactly as she said it. He would not change the words to make them more exciting or more palatable for his audience. He agreed, his eyes bright with a mixture of surprise and professional eagerness. They sat in the shade of the cottonwood tree where she taught, the same tree under which they had buried Evan Hale's memory so many years ago. Tahan stood nearby, not listening, but watching. A silent guardian. Lucia played by the river, her laughter a bright, musical counterpoint to the somber tones of her mother's voice. At first, the words came with difficulty. She spoke of Boston, of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She described the damp chill of the city, the oppressive weight of her aunt's expectations, the feeling of a corset tightening not just around her ribs, but around her spirit. She spoke of her escape, of the desperate hope for a new life, a place where she could finally breathe. Then she spoke of Red Mesa. The journalist's pen began to fly across the page. The red dust was in her voice, the blinding glare of the sun, the smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies. She described the moment she first saw Tahan, the quiet dignity of the man who saved her, and the ugly sneer in the eyes of the men who watched. She told of the bank robbery, of the brutal injustice of his arrest, and of the storm that had hidden her act of rebellion. When she spoke of the night in the cave, her voice dropped to a near whisper. She was no longer speaking to the journalist. She was speaking to the memory itself. She described the roar of the wind, the tiny, brave flame of the fire, the feeling of the world being stripped away until nothing was left but two lonely souls. She spoke of the painful pressure in her lungs and of his gentle, methodical hands undoing the buttons of her dress, unlacing the corset that had been her cage. She told him of the first deep, true breath she had taken, and the dizzying, terrifying freedom of it. She told him of the words she had gasped, the desperate, half-joking plea for a marriage she never thought possible. She did not look at the journalist, but she could feel the stillness of his attention, the sudden understanding that this was not just a story of adventure. It was a story of a profound and unexpected intimacy, a bearing of souls in the heart of a storm. She told him everything: the fire, the escape, the long, perilous journey south, the kindness of Senora Luz, the birth of their daughter, the plague that had nearly destroyed them. She spoke of Evan Hale's sacrifice, of a man who had chosen mercy over the law he was sworn to uphold. When she was finished, a deep silence settled over the courtyard, broken only by the sound of the river and the distant laughter of her child. Arthur Vance did not speak for a long time. He simply looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and then at Tahan, who had moved to stand beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The journalist slowly closed his notebook. He had come looking for a legend, a sensational tale of the Wild West. He had found something far more rare and far more powerful. He had found the truth. Months later, a package arrived with a trading caravan. It contained a copy of a New York newspaper, weeks old. The article was there, spread across 2 pages under a bold headline, "The Teacher and the Warrior." An American love story. Vance had kept his word. Mostly. He had sensationalized parts of it, emphasizing the danger and the violence for his readers. The article caused a stir. Just as Abigail had feared, letters were written to the editor. Some called the story a beautiful testament to the human spirit. Others condemned it as a scandalous tale of a woman who had forsaken her race and her civilization. The world, it seemed, was eager to debate the nature of their love, to categorize it, to judge it. Abigail and Tahan read the article together, sitting at the small wooden table in their home. When they were done, Abigail looked at Tahan, a small, knowing smile on her lips. She thought of the loud, certain voices in Boston, in Red Mesa, and now in the pages of this newspaper, all of them so sure they understood her life. "The world can talk," she said softly. "We just live." Tahan nodded, his hand covering hers on the table. That evening, he brought out a small, misshapen lump of tallow, carefully wrapped in a piece of cloth. It was the stub of the candle from their wedding night, the one he had saved all these years. He lit the old wick. It sputtered for a moment before catching, casting a small, gentle circle of light. The flame trembled in the evening breeze. A tiny, fragile thing. But it did not go out. It held steady, a quiet light in the immense and gathering darkness, a reflection of the time that had passed, and the love that had endured. 2 decades is long enough for the course of a river to change, for a sapling to become a shade tree, and for a hunted girl to become a woman of quiet, unshakable strength. The world had spun on its axis some 7,000 times since they had last seen the northern horizon, and each turn had etched a new line of peace onto their lives. The house by the river was no longer new, its adobe walls weathered to the soft, warm color of the earth itself, its wooden door silvery and smooth from years of use. The cornfield was wider, the herd of horses in the corral larger and known throughout the region for their sure-footed intelligence. The valley was their home, a place not of exile, but of belonging. Luzia was a woman now, with the sun of 20 Sonoran summers in her skin. She was a startling, beautiful fusion of her parents. She had Tahan's dark, thoughtful eyes that could read the mood of a horse or the coming of a storm. But she had Abigail's smile, a quick, intelligent curve of the lips that revealed a mind as sharp and inquisitive as her mother's had ever been. She moved with a dancer's grace, equally at home skinning a rabbit for the stew pot or sitting in the shade with a tattered copy of a book her mother had somehow managed to acquire. Tahan had taught her to ride before she could properly walk, to track, to listen to the language of the wind. Abigail had taught her to read, to question, to see the world not just as it was, but as it could be. Lucia was the living, breathing proof of their union, a new kind of person for a new world, a child of the borderlands who belonged fully to both and to neither. Abigail's hair, once the color of dark honey, was now more silver than not. A fine, shining web that she wore tied back in a simple knot. The years had been kind to her face, softening the sharp angles of youth and replacing them with the gentle lines of laughter and concern. She was the valley's matriarch, the healer whose knowledge had saved them from the fever, the teacher who had given the gift of letters to 2 generations of children. The fearful, corseted girl from Boston was a ghost, a story she sometimes told her daughter, a person so distant she could hardly believe she had ever been her. Tahan remained strong, his body leaner but corded with the tough, wiry muscle of a man who has worked hard his entire life. The fire in his eyes had not dimmed, but it had changed. The warrior's cold, watchful flame had been banked and transformed into the steady, warm glow of a patriarch, a father, a husband. His greatest joy was teaching Lucia the ways of the horse, not just how to ride, but how to understand, to form a partnership of trust and respect. He would watch her for hours as she galloped along the riverbank, her black hair flying behind her, and in his gaze was a profound and quiet contentment that was more eloquent than any words. The news came, as news always did, with a traveling trader, a man who brought salt and coffee and stories from the world beyond the mountains. He spoke of new laws in the United States, of a government that was finally, belatedly, trying to make some kind of peace with the native peoples it had so long persecuted. He spoke of an amnesty, a general pardon for the Navajo people involved in the conflicts of the past decades, the bounty on Tahan Yazi's head. The piece of paper that had been the boogeyman of their early years was now just a worthless, forgotten scrap. They were, in the eyes of the law that had once hunted them, finally free. The news did not bring the relief Abigail might have once expected. Instead, it brought a familiar, unwelcome tightening in her chest. The word amnesty implied a crime, a forgiveness for a wrong that had never been committed, and it was a doorway, a creaking open of a portal to a past she had thought was sealed forever. That night, she watched Tahan as he sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his face unreadable. She knew what he was thinking, the land of his birth, the canyons and mesas that were in his blood, the resting places of his ancestors. "Why would we go back?" she asked, her voice quiet. "This is our home. We have everything we need here. Lucia was born here." Tahan did not look at her, but continued to watch the fire. "It is not about going back to live," he said. "It is about a journey." He turned to her then, and she saw the deep, ancient longing in his eyes. "My spirit has been here, with you all these years, but a piece of it has always remained there." I want to stand on the earth of my people one last time. I want to show my daughter where her father's life began. A few days later, it was Lucia who settled the matter. "Mother," she said, coming to Abigail as she tended her small herb garden, "I want to see it. I want to see the place you have told me about. The Red Rocks, the land where Father's people lived. It is half of my story, and I do not know it." Looking at her daughter's earnest, curious face, Abigail knew they had to go. To deny Lucia this was to deny her a part of herself. Their life in the valley was a beautiful, strong tree, but its roots drew from two different kinds of soil. It was time to honor them both. They made the journey north in the spring, when the days were warm and the nights were cool. It was the opposite of their desperate flight south 2 decades before. They were not two starved, wounded fugitives scanning the horizon for enemies. They were a family, strong and confident, traveling with good horses and ample supplies. They moved without haste, savoring the journey, the land that had once been their enemy now revealing its stark, breathtaking beauty to them. One afternoon, as they rode through a particularly arid stretch of high desert, Abigail reined in her horse. She pointed. "Look." Against the red rock of a canyon wall stood a tall, ancient saguaro cactus, and from its spiny, formidable arms, a single, perfect flower had burst forth. It was a bloom of impossible delicacy, its white petals like fine silk, its golden center a tiny, brilliant sun, a flower of stunning, defiant beauty, born from the harshest, most unforgiving of plants. It had weathered decades of drought and heat, and now it was blooming. Tahan brought his horse alongside hers. He looked at the flower, and then at her, and he understood. It was a symbol of their life, a thing of beauty and resilience that had grown out of pain and hardship. Abigail's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming clarity. "All those years," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I thought of us as fugitives. I thought of us as running from the law, from everything. But that was not the truth." She looked at Tahan, at the strong, noble lines of his face, and then at Lucia, their beautiful, vibrant daughter. "We were not fugitives. We were just people trying to live free." The words hung in the clean desert air, a final, definitive statement. It was a reframing of their entire existence, a rejection of the labels the world had tried to put on them. They had not been running from something. They had been running toward something, toward each other, toward this life. When they finally reached the high country of northern Arizona, the land of Tahan's birth, they found it both the same and irrevocably changed. The sky was the same impossible, aching blue. The wind still whispered the same ancient stories through the canyons. But the people were gone, moved to reservations, their old home sites silent and empty. They made their way to Red Mesa, or what was left of it. The mining boom had been a flash in the pan. The vein of silver had run out, and the town had withered and died. Now, only the skeletal remains of a few buildings stood against the sky, their roofs caved in, their walls crumbling. The wind, its only resident, whispered through empty doorways and broken windows. The place that had been the source of so much hatred, so much violence and fear, was nothing more than a ghost town. Its passions and its prejudices returned to the dust from which they had come. On their last morning, before turning south again, back toward their home, Tahan led them to a low hill that overlooked the ruins. They stood there, the three of them, as the sun began its slow ascent, setting the eastern horizon on fire. The light spilled across the land, painting the silent, ruined town in soft shades of pink and gold. It was the same sun, the same hill, the same view as the dawn that had begun the shootout 20 years before. But the world was different. They were different. The violence and the terror were gone, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. Abigail stood beside her husband, her hand linked with his, their daughter standing tall and proud between them. She looked at the ruins, not with fear or anger, but with a strange sense of gratitude. It was a place of ghosts, but it was also the place where her true life had begun. It was the fire in which her old self had been burned away, and from whose ashes she had been reborn. She looked at Tahan, and he smiled at her, a smile that held 20 years of shared sunrises, of hardships overcome, and of a love that had proven as resilient and as beautiful as a flower blooming in the desert. They watched the sun climb higher, a new day dawning on the place where it all began. The journalist Arthur Vance's article had been a sensation for a season, and then, like all stories, it had faded, becoming another footnote in the sprawling, violent epic of the American West. But for some, it did not fade. For a young writer named Samuel Keene, born in the year the article was published. The story of the teacher and the warrior was not history. It was a living text, a map to a truth he felt was missing from the world he knew. He found Vance's original notes in a dusty university archive, a collection of papers bequeathed upon the journalist's death. The notes were rougher, more intimate than the published piece, filled with sketches of the valley, transcripts of Abigail's words, and Vance's own awestruck observations. Samuel knew then that he had to go. He had to walk the path they walked, to see if any trace of their extraordinary love remained on the land itself. His journey began, as theirs had ended, in Red Mesa. He arrived not on horseback, but on a sputtering motor car that seemed to complain at every rut in the road. The town was exactly as the final chapter of their story had described it, a collection of bones bleaching in the sun. Wind was the only mayor, the only sheriff, the only citizen. It sighed through the hollow eyes of the old saloon and whispered secrets in the collapsed nave of a tiny church. Samuel walked the single street, Vance's notes in his hand, trying to place the bank, the livery, the burnt-out patch of ground where the schoolhouse had stood. He felt like an archaeologist of emotions, sifting through layers of silence for the echoes of gunfire and the ghost of a desperate choice. He stood on the hill where they had stood, looking out at the sunrise over the ruins. The world was beautiful and empty, and he understood that the violence had consumed itself, leaving nothing behind. The story was not here. This was just the preface. Following the faint trail laid out in Vance's notes, Samuel traveled south into Sonora. The journey was still hard, the sun still a relentless hammer, but he traveled with maps and canteens, not with a wound and a prayer. He crossed the border, a simple line in the sand, and felt a shift not just in geography, but in time. The further south he went, the more the frantic energy of his own century seemed to recede, replaced by an older, slower rhythm. He found the valley by the river. It was not a ghost town. It was a thriving, quiet community, a tapestry of green fields and sturdy adobe homes. The horses that grazed in the pastures were magnificent, with the same intelligent eyes and strong lines that Vance had described. He asked around, speaking his clumsy Spanish, showing a copy of the old article. The younger people shrugged, but an old man, his face a testament to 100 years of sun, nodded slowly. He pointed toward a house that sat a little apart from the others, shaded by a massive cottonwood tree. La Maestra, he said, the name a soft, revered sound on his tongue. La Casa de la Nieta, the house of the granddaughter. He approached the house with a sense of profound trepidation, as if he were about to step onto holy ground. A woman came to the door, her hair a cascade of silver black, her eyes holding the same startling, intelligent mix of her ancestors. She was the daughter of Lucia, the granddaughter of Abigail and Tahan. She listened to his story, her expression patient, and then she invited him inside. The house was cool and dark, filled with the smell of dried herbs and wood smoke. It was a place of deep, abiding peace. They spoke for hours. She told him of her mother, Lucia, who had become the valley's leader, a woman of great wisdom and strength, who had passed away only a few years before. She spoke of her grandparents as the founders of a dynasty, not of wealth or power, but of spirit. They were the roots of the valley. The story that all other stories grew from. When he finally explained what he was looking for, the true purpose of his pilgrimage, she smiled a sad, knowing smile. "My grandmother kept many things," she said, "but one thing she treasured above all others." She led him to a small, dark wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, she lifted a smaller box, carved from juniper wood with the image of a hawk in flight. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was the stub of an old tallow candle. It was a lumpy, misshapen thing, little more than a thumb's length of wax with a blackened wick. It was an object of no value, a piece of forgotten history that would mean nothing to anyone else in the world. But to Samuel, it was everything. It was the witness to their wedding. It was the light in the cave, the hope in the storm. It was the defiant flame they had lit against the darkness of the world, a fragile spark of love and honor that had refused to be extinguished. He looked at the simple, sacred object, and he could almost feel the heat it had given off, could almost hear the whisper of their vows on the wind. He stayed for a week, listening to the granddaughter's stories, walking by the river, and absorbing the profound peace of the place they had built. He learned that they were buried together on the hill overlooking the valley, under a simple stone marker that had no names, only the carving of a hawk and a wildflower. Their story had not ended. It had been absorbed into the land, into the people, into the very water that gave the valley life. On his final evening, the granddaughter allowed him to take the small wooden box outside. He sat by the river as the sun went down, the sky turning from a fiery orange to a deep, bruised purple. He did not try to light the candle. Its purpose was not to burn, but to endure. He held the box in his hands, a tangible link to a love that felt more real and more powerful than anything in his modern, noisy world. He thought of all the loud, violent stories that were told about the West, the tales of gunslingers and gold miners. And he thought of this quiet story, this story of a love that had asked for nothing more than the freedom to exist. The world had long since forgotten their names, but that did not matter. What they had built, what they had been to each other, was still here. He could feel it in the cool desert air, in the gentle murmur of the river, in the silent, watchful gaze of the stars as they began to appear, one by one. In the infinite darkness above, under the dust and the stars, somewhere in the desert wind, their light still burns. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.